At 7 a.m. on April 5th, 1945, a U.S. lieutenant crawled alone through mud toward a German bunker that had already killed dozens of Americans. Instead of attacking it, he noticed two metal cylinders sticking out of a narrow slit. 10 seconds later, 2 Germans were dead, the bunker was silent, and an entire platoon was no longer marked for death. At dawn, Company C of the 370th Infantry moved uphill toward Castello Aghinolfi, a stone fortress anchoring the western edge of the German Gothic line. 3 previous American assaults had failed on this slope. The terrain offered no cover, no flanking routes, only open ground exposed to observation and fire. 2nd Lieutenant Vernon Baker led the weapons platoon, 25 men with mortars and machine guns, most of them replacements who had never been under fire. The advance began after artillery preparation, but as the hours passed, the German response remained eerily light. By 0700, Baker's platoon had pushed farther than the rifle companies and found themselves alone in a shallow draw, just 250 yards from the castle. That was when the mortars began to fall with precision. Shells landed short, then closer, walking steadily toward the platoon's position. This was not random fire. Someone was watching them. They scanned the hillside and spotted the source. Cut into reinforced concrete was a narrow observation slit, barely wide enough for optics. From it protruded 2 metal cylinders, steady and unmoving. German artillery observers were inside, tracking every American movement below and adjusting fire in real time. As long as that slit remained active, Baker's platoon would be annihilated where they lay. Artillery support was unavailable. A frontal assault would be suicide. He made his decision alone. He removed his steel helmet, kept his wool capliner, and began to crawl uphill through the mud, directly toward the bunker that was killing his men. At first light, Company C stepped off toward Castello Aghinolfi, the stone strong point that sealed the western end of the German Gothic line. 3 American assaults had already failed here. The slope was bare, steep, and exposed. A killing ground watched from above. 2nd Lieutenant Vernon Baker led the weapons platoon, 25 men carrying mortars and machine guns, most of them replacements who had never heard live rounds crack overhead. The attack moved slowly. German small arms fire was strangely light, almost cautious, and that worried Baker more than heavy resistance would have. By 0700 hours, his platoon had advanced beyond the rifle companies and settled into a shallow draw just 250 yards from the castle. That was when the first mortar rounds landed. The explosions were methodical, not random, one short, one closer, each adjustment tightening the pattern. Someone was watching. Someone was correcting fire. He lifted his binoculars and searched the hillside. Near the castle wall he saw it, a narrow slit cut into reinforced concrete. From the opening protruded 2 dull metal cylinders, perfectly still. German observation optics. Inside the bunker, at least 2 men were calmly tracking American movement and calling down death with mathematical precision. As long as that slit remained active, Baker's platoon was already dead. Calls for immediate artillery support went unanswered. Higher headquarters didn't believe Americans had advanced this far. A frontal attack on the bunker would mean charging open ground under direct observation. Waiting meant being bracketed into oblivion. Baker understood the equation instantly. If the observers lived, his men died. Without signaling anyone, he slid his steel helmet off, pulled his wool capliner tighter, and began crawling alone through the mud straight toward the observation slit that was killing his platoon. Baker reached the base of the bunker unseen. From this angle, the slit was no wider than a man's hand, cut cleanly through concrete and angled slightly downward toward the valley. The 2 metal cylinders protruding from it were close enough to touch. Inside, shadows moved. The German observers were still working, still calling corrections, unaware that the threat was now beneath them. Baker brought his M1 Garand up slowly and rested the barrel against a rock to steady it. He didn't aim at a man. He aimed into the space. He slid the muzzle directly into the slit, angled it upward, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked once, then again, the shots deafening inside the concrete chamber. 8 rounds emptied into the bunker in seconds, the sound trapped and magnified by the reinforced walls. Inside, there was no room to escape, no cover, no warning. When the clip ejected with its metallic ping, the 2 cylinders sagged and disappeared from view. Baker held his position, reloaded, and kept the rifle trained on the opening. He waited. Nothing moved. No return fire. No sound. The observation post was dead. The eyes guiding the mortars were gone. For the first time since the advance began, the hillside went quiet. Baker slid back from the bunker and moved laterally along the slope, knowing the moment wouldn't last. Destroying the observers had bought his men time, but the castle still held guns, and the fight was far from over. Baker moved along the hillside, keeping low, scanning for the next threat before it could reveal itself. 30 yards from the destroyed observation post, he nearly walked past it, a machine gun position, so well camouflaged with rubble and vegetation that it blended into the slope. Inside sat a German MG-42 team. The men were relaxed, eating from ration tins, confident their observers were still guiding fire. They never looked up. Raised his M1 and fired twice at point-blank range. Both Germans dropped where they sat. The MG-42, still mounted and loaded, was aimed directly down the approach his platoon would have used. Left untouched, it would have cut them apart in seconds. Baker kicked the gun off its mount and kept moving. Later, another German appeared and threw a grenade that failed to detonate. Baker shot him as he turned to run. He pushed on, found a hidden dugout entrance disguised beneath a painted tarp, and borrowed a Thompson submachine gun. He lobbed a grenade inside. When a stunned German stumbled out, Baker cut him down. 2 more died inside the dugout from a second blast. Late morning, German mortars returned, this time closer, heavier. Baker's platoon was bracketed again. Men were torn apart where they lay. Of the 25 soldiers who had advanced that morning, only 8 remained combat effective. Requests for counter-battery fire were initially denied. Higher headquarters still refused to believe Americans were this close to the castle. Shelling paused. Baker realized the truth. They were isolated, outnumbered, and nearly out of ammunition. Then he saw movement on the slope below, a platoon of Germans advancing under Red Cross flags, moving slowly, deliberately. Baker watched through his sights as they closed to 50 yards. Stretchers dropped. The flags fell away. An MG-42 appeared where a wounded man should have been. The deception lasted less than a second. Baker's men opened fire instantly. The Germans broke under the surprise resistance and fled, leaving their dead behind. Baker assessed what was left. 8 men. No reinforcements. The enemy now fully alert. Holding meant death. Staying was no longer courage, it was waste. He made the hardest call a leader can make and ordered a fighting withdrawal, knowing the retreat would be just as deadly as the advance. Baker took the rear position himself. As his men pulled back in short bounds, German fire followed them from the hillside. 1 soldier went down to a sniper's shot. Baker kept moving, covering the retreat alone, scanning for muzzle flashes instead of safety. On the withdrawal route, he found what would have finished them 2 hidden machine gun nests positioned to rake the escape path. Baker crawled forward under fire, pulled the pin on a white phosphorus grenade, and threw it into the first position. The blast ignited the bunker from the inside. Screams followed. He repeated the process on the second nest, clearing the route with fire that burned hotter than steel. The retreat continued through rubble and smoke. Another man was killed, another wounded. Mortars bracketed again. Baker destroyed 2 more machine gun positions during the withdrawal, not advancing, but hunting threats so the remaining men could live. By the time they reached the battalion aid station late that afternoon, only 6 of the original 25 were still alive. Baker collapsed at the roadside, vomiting from exhaustion. 12 hours of continuous combat were over. He had personally killed 9 Germans, destroyed multiple fortified positions, and turned a doomed platoon into survivors. That night, he guided another regiment through the same ground, pointing out every gun, every slit, every place men had died. Next morning, Castello Aghinolfi was empty. The Germans had abandoned it. The fortress that had resisted 3 assaults fell without a fight because one lieutenant had broken its eyes, dismantled its defenses, and refused to stop fighting even while retreating. By nightfall, the hillside was quiet in a way that only followed exhaustion, not peace. Smoke hung low over the ruined ground, drifting through olive trees and shattered stone. Baker sat briefly with the 6 men who were left, all of them hollow-eyed, uniforms stiff with dried mud and blood that wasn't always their own. None of them spoke about what had happened. They didn't need to. The empty spaces where 19 voices should have been said everything. Baker finally stood. His legs trembled, not from fear, but from the delayed cost of 12 straight hours of decision-making under fire. He gathered the dog tags from the dead, one by one, pressing each into his palm before stringing them together. It was the last thing he could do for the men who hadn't made it back. Then he walked alone toward regimental headquarters through darkness broken by sporadic flares and distant gunfire. Sherman was waiting. His first concern was not casualties. It was Baker's missing steel helmet. The reprimand came quickly, formally, as if the day had been routine. An intelligence officer was ordered to issue Baker a proper helmet. Only after that did the colonel explain the plan. For the next morning, a white infantry regiment would attack the castle at dawn. They needed someone who knew the ground. He volunteered without hesitation. He walked the same slope again, this time guiding officers through terrain still littered with bodies. He pointed out the destroyed observation slit, the burned machine gun nests, the dugout entrances hidden beneath tarps and paint. Each location carried a memory. But Baker spoke in calm, precise language, the way a professional briefs a problem already solved. He did not describe heroics. He described angles, distances, fields of fire. The castle loomed above them, dark and silent, no longer threatening, just empty stone. First light on April 6th, the regiment advanced. They expected resistance. They found none. The Germans had withdrawn during the night, abandoning Castello Aghinolfi entirely. The defensive network had been broken so thoroughly that holding the position was no longer possible. The fortress that had killed men for days fell without a shot fired. Baker, there was no celebration. The victory came too late for 19 men who would never leave that hillside. Later, the paperwork moved upward. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was downgraded. No explanation was recorded. Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross instead. Others received medals for actions that did not come close to the scale or consequence of what had happened on April 5th. Baker said nothing. He stayed in the army. He did his job. Years passed. The army changed slowly. Units were desegregated. Baker commanded soldiers who once would not have been allowed to serve under him. He fought in another war. He retired quietly. He built a cabin far from crowds and uniforms, preferring wilderness to ceremony. When people called him a hero, he shifted uncomfortably. He never argued, but he never accepted it either. Heroes, in his mind, were the ones whose dog tags he had carried up that hill. Half a century later, the files were reopened. Names were removed. Race was removed. Actions were judged on merit alone. 7 men were identified as having been denied the nation's highest honor. Baker was the only one still alive. In 1997, a president placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. Baker wept not for himself, but for the men who were not there to see it. He said the award did not belong to him alone. It belonged to those who had fought and died, believing their country would never fully see them. History is often defined not by recognition, but by moments. And the moment that mattered came years earlier. In 10 silent seconds beneath a German bunker, a lieutenant, crawling through mud, noticed something others would have missed. 2 metal cylinders, a narrow slit, a structure designed to see without being seen. He did not think in terms of bravery or legacy. He thought in terms of function, what the enemy had built, what it was meant to do, and how it could be turned against them. The decision saved lives. It broke a fortress. It collapsed a defensive line. It proved that leadership under fire is not about aggression, but about clarity, about seeing a problem as it is and acting before fear has time to speak. The battle lasted 12 hours. Baker's career lasted decades. His life lasted 90 years. But those 10 seconds defined all of it. Because 2 Germans died. One man refused to accept that the situation was impossible, and 6 men lived because of it. After the gunfire faded, what remained was not the sound of victory, but the weight of responsibility. Baker never spoke about April 5th as a triumph. To him, it was a ledger that never balanced. 19 names outweighed every tactical success. Every position he destroyed, every German he killed, existed in his memory alongside the men who never walked back down that hill. A sense of accounting followed him for the rest of his life. In the years after the war, Baker stayed in uniform while the world tried to forget. The Army quietly rewrote its own rules. Segregated units dissolved. Old assumptions were retired without apology. Baker watched younger officers rise in a system that had once refused to acknowledge his competence. When desegregation finally came, he was ready, not because history demanded it, but because he had already proven what leadership looked like when failure meant death. He never used April 5th to advance himself. He never cited it in arguments or leveraged it for promotion. When asked about combat, he spoke about preparation, about discipline, about not confusing bravery with stubbornness. He told younger soldiers that the hardest decision a leader will ever make is not when to attack, but when to pull men out before courage becomes waste. Battlefield lessons from Castello Aghinolfi were not about weapons or heroics. They were about perception. Baker survived because he saw what others missed, not just the observation slit, but the pattern behind it, how the enemy watched, how they corrected fire, how terrain shaped decisions, how arrogance blinded defenders who believed concrete and elevation made them untouchable. Awareness became his doctrine. Use the enemy's confidence against them. Let their systems betray their weaknesses. Never assume a position is invulnerable simply because it was designed to be. Lessons outlived the war. Historians revisited the Italian campaign. Baker's actions stood out not because of their violence, but because of their efficiency. He destroyed more enemy positions while withdrawing than most units did while advancing. He converted retreat into control. He demonstrated that survival under pressure is not passive. It requires active destruction of threats, even while moving away. For 52 years, the official record treated April 5th as an anomaly, a brave day, a commendable officer, nothing more. Silence was not accidental. He was not prepared to confront what his actions implied. That competence had been present all along. That assumptions about race, leadership, and courage had been false. That men had died under lesser commanders, while one of their best had been deliberately overlooked. Review finally came in the 1,990 seconds. It stripped the files of names and skin color and let the actions speak alone. The result was unavoidable. Baker's record was undeniable. The Medal of Honor ceremony did not change the past. It could not bring back the 19 men lost on the hillside. It could not erase decades of institutional failure. What it did was simpler and, in some ways, heavier. It forced the truth into the open. He accepted the medal quietly. He did not frame it as vindication. He framed it as closure for the men whose courage had never been acknowledged. He said their names mattered more than his. After the ceremony, he returned to Idaho, to trees and snow and silence, to a life measured in seasons rather than headlines. He hunted, he walked, He lived as a man who had already carried more than most people ever would. Baker died in 2010. The obituaries listed his medals, his rank, his service. What they could not fully capture was the moment that defined him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Lieutenant, alone in the mud, saw 2 cylinders protruding from concrete. He understood what they meant. He understood what would happen if he did nothing, and he understood that waiting for permission would kill his men. He acted. Of the cylinder trick. Not innovation, not daring, but clarity under pressure. The ability to see a problem exactly as it is, strip away fear and noise, and apply force only where it matters. Wars change, weapons evolve, doctrine shifts, but that kind of leadership does not age. It lives in those 10 seconds. Because one lieutenant refused to look away. War does not create competence, it exposes it. In normal conditions, systems hide weakness. Rank, procedure, paperwork, and authority can make an average leader appear capable. But when conditions collapse, when communication fails, support disappears, and decisions must be made in seconds, with lives at stake, only real competence remains. Everything else burns away. April 5, 1945, Vernon Baker did not operate inside a functioning system. Artillery support was delayed because higher headquarters refused to believe his unit had advanced so far. His platoon was isolated, outnumbered, exposed on open ground, and watched by an enemy that had every advantage of elevation and preparation. Baker did not have superior firepower. He did not have superior numbers. He did not even have institutional trust. What he had was perception. The defining moment of that day was not the rifle shots fired into the observation slit. That was merely the visible outcome. The real act occurred earlier, inside Baker's mind, when he identified the true source of the danger. Most soldiers under mortar fire focus on the explosions. Baker focused on the pattern. Mortars were landing with precision, adjusting in predictable increments. That meant observation. Observation meant eyes. Eyes meant vulnerability. Distinction separates capable leaders from reactive ones. Reactive leaders fight symptoms. Capable leaders identify systems. Baker understood that destroying firepower was unnecessary if he could destroy the mechanism guiding it. He did not attack the fortress. He attacked its vision. This principle applies far beyond warfare. In organizations, failures rarely originate where they appear. They originate where information is gathered, interpreted, and converted into action. Most people respond by applying more effort, more resources, or more noise. Baker responded by removing the enemy's ability to see. Decision-making was not impulsive, it was disciplined. 8 rounds fired, no wasted movement, no emotional excess. Violence applied with restraint. This discipline mattered because excess would have revealed his position, wasted ammunition, or created chaos. Instead, he achieved maximum effect with minimal action, that is, competence under pressure. The day progressed. Baker faced an even harder challenge. The situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Casualties mounted, ammunition ran low, reinforcements did not arrive. This is the moment where poor leaders cling to objectives and good leaders accept reality. Baker chose withdrawal not because he lacked courage, but because continuing would mean pointless death. Withdrawal is often misunderstood as weakness. In truth, it requires a clearer understanding of reality than attack. Attack can be emotional. Withdrawal demands honesty. Baker did not retreat passively. He transformed withdrawal into an active operation, destroying threats along the escape route, taking the most dangerous positions himself, and reducing risk for others at his own expense. This is another hallmark of true competence. The most capable individual must assume the greatest risk, not for moral symbolism, but for statistical survival. Baker understood that his experience gave him the highest probability of success under fire. By placing himself in danger, he increased the survival chances of those who remained. Decades, the system failed to recognize this competence. That failure does not diminish the reality of what occurred. Truth exists independent of recognition. Baker's effectiveness was real on April 5th, regardless of medals awarded or denied. History eventually corrected the record, but competence had already done its work long before acknowledgement arrived. The lasting lesson is simple and brutal. In moments of collapse, credentials vanish, systems fail, titles lose meaning. What remains is perception, discipline, and responsibility. Vernon Baker survived and saved others not because he was braver than anyone else, but because he saw the problem clearly and acted precisely while others hesitated. What competence looks like when there is no margin for error. Leadership is often portrayed as forward motion, advance, attack, capture, hold. But real leadership under extreme conditions is defined not by movement, but by preservation. The most important question a leader can ask is not how to win, but who will die if the decision is wrong. On April 5th, 1945, Vernon Baker answered that question repeatedly, and each answer carried weight he bore for the rest of his life. Baker's actions are frequently described as heroic, but heroism is a shallow word when examined closely. What he demonstrated was something rarer: responsibility without illusion. He never believed the situation would resolve itself. He never trusted that courage alone would change physics, numbers, or terrain. He understood that leadership is not about optimism. It is about control of outcomes under constraint. Baker crawled toward the observation slit. He was not seeking glory. He was buying time. Time is the most valuable currency in combat. Every second the enemy observes is a second closer to annihilation. By eliminating the observers, Baker disrupted the enemy's ability to control time and space. That single act reduced pressure on his platoon and delayed their destruction. When confronted with enemy troops abusing the Red Cross symbol, Baker again demonstrated a harsh but necessary leadership principle. Moral rules exist to protect the innocent, not to enable exploitation. Hesitation in that moment would have meant death for his men. Leadership sometimes requires immediate action without moral comfort. Casualties mounted, Baker faced the defining test of command. Continuing to hold position would have been praised as bravery. It would also have killed everyone left. Baker rejected the false nobility of sacrifice for its own sake. He chose withdrawal not as surrender, but as survival strategy. This decision highlights a critical truth. Leadership is measured by outcomes, not appearances. Many leaders fail because they confuse resolve with rigidity. Baker remained resolved to protect his men, not to defend a patch of ground. When those goals diverged, he chose people over position. In the retreat, Baker repeatedly exposed himself to danger to neutralize threats ahead of his men. This was not theatrical self-sacrifice. It was tactical necessity. The most capable person assumed the highest risk role because that maximized group survival. Leadership here was not about inspiring speeches or symbolic gestures. It was about math. In the war, Baker did not seek recognition. He did not frame his actions as exceptional. He carried the memory of 19 dead men more heavily than any medal. When recognition finally arrived decades later, it did not rewrite history for him. It merely aligned official narrative with reality. The lesson is uncomfortable. Leadership is not rewarded proportionally to its cost. Often, it is ignored, delayed, or misattributed. That does not absolve the leader of responsibility. Baker acted knowing that survival, not praise, was the only meaningful outcome. Modern contexts, business, crisis management, emergency response, the same principle applies. Leaders who preserve people during failure accomplish more than those who chase symbolic victories. The ability to withdraw intelligently, to reduce loss, and to accept imperfect outcomes separates mature leadership from performative authority. Baker's legacy is not the cylinder trick. It is the demonstration that leadership under extreme pressure is not about advancing at all costs. It is about making decisions that allow others to live, even when history may never fully understand the price paid. The burden of real leadership. Leadership under extreme pressure strips away every comforting illusion people carry about control. It reveals that most decisions are not between good and bad, but between loss and greater loss. Vernon Baker understood this instinctively, not because he was taught it in manuals, but because reality forced it upon him hour by hour on that hillside. Every choice he made reduced one danger while exposing him to another. That trade-off never stopped. It never simplifies. It only ends when the fighting ends, or when the leader does. What separates Baker from less capable commanders is that he never pretended otherwise. He did not convince himself that courage would bend outcomes in his favor. He did not assume that sacrifice automatically produced meaning. He treated survival as a technical problem, not a moral fantasy. Who is exposed? Who is seen? Who is targeted? Who moves first? Who draws fire? Who absorbs risk? These questions guided his decisions, not slogans or doctrine. This is why his actions feel uncomfortable to romanticize. There is nothing cinematic about crawling alone toward a bunker, knowing that no one is watching and no one may ever know what you did. There is no reassurance in ordering a withdrawal while knowing that history often mistakes retreat for failure. There is no pride in carrying dog tags instead of flags. Leadership at this level is quiet, isolating, and deeply personal. Many people misunderstand courage as fearlessness. Baker's actions show the opposite. Fear was present throughout the day. The difference is that fear never became the decision maker. It was information, not authority. He acted not because he felt confident, but because delay would cost lives. That distinction matters. Confidence is optional. Responsibility is not. Another lesson, often overlooked, is how Baker managed uncertainty. He never had full information. He did not know how many Germans remained. He did not know whether reinforcements would arrive. He did not know if the next position was empty or occupied. He acted anyway, accepting uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary obstacle. This is a critical leadership skill rarely taught, the ability to commit under incomplete information without freezing or fantasizing. Equally important is what Baker did not do. He did not chase revenge. He did not pursue destruction beyond necessity. He did not allow anger to dictate tempo. His use of force remained purposeful even after watching his men die. That level of restraint under emotional stress is not instinctive. It is learned through discipline and internal control. Without it, leaders become liabilities the moment pressure rises. The aftermath of the battle reinforces another uncomfortable truth. Doing the right thing does not guarantee immediate recognition. Baker's actions were documented. They were known. They were recommended. They were still downgraded. Systems protect themselves before they protect truth. This does not invalidate moral action, but it explains why relying on recognition as motivation is dangerous. Leaders who require validation will hesitate when validation is unlikely. Baker did not hesitate. The parallels are direct. Crisis leaders often operate in environments where success looks like failure to outsiders. Downsizing to save an organization, canceling a project to protect a team, withdrawing from a market to preserve long-term viability. These decisions attract criticism precisely because they avoid dramatic collapse. Quiet prevention rarely looks heroic. Hardest leadership decisions rarely produce visible victories. They produce absence of disaster. Fewer funerals, fewer names on lists, fewer consequences that never appear because someone intervened early and decisively. Baker's story reminds us that prevention is invisible by nature, and leaders must be willing to accept that invisibility. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is personal. Baker never framed himself as exceptional. He did not build identity around that day. He carried its weight without turning it into ego. That humility is not modesty. It is realism. He knew that circumstances, timing, and preparation aligned just enough to allow survival. Another inch of exposure, another second of delay, and the outcome would have been different. Leaders who understand this remain grounded. Those who do not become reckless. History finally recognized Baker. It did not change what mattered. 6 men lived. 19 did not. The medal acknowledged truth, but it did not define it. Truth had already been written in mud, blood, and decisions made without witnesses. The value of this story is not inspiration, it is instruction. Leadership is not about advancing narratives, it is about managing consequences. It is not about being remembered. It is about being reliable when conditions collapse. It is not about winning cleanly. It is about choosing loss wisely. Baker's lesson endures because it refuses comfort. It tells us that leadership means acting without certainty, accepting blame without recognition, and carrying outcomes long after the noise fades. That is not romantic. It is real. That is why it matters. After the moment of decision, long after the noise fades and the situation resolves, what remains is memory, consequence, and the quiet reckoning that follows survival. Vernon Baker lived with that reckoning for the rest of his life, not as a burden he spoke about, but as a presence that shaped how he understood responsibility. Survival did not free him from April 5th. It bound him to it. Another truth rarely acknowledged. Leaders do not leave crises behind when they walk away. They carry them forward, often alone. Others remember outcomes. Leaders remember moments. They remember the second before acting, the uncertainty, the faces of those who depended on them without question. Baker remembered the men who followed him into fire because they trusted his judgment more than their fear. That trust is the heaviest thing a leader can ever hold. At Hillside, Baker did not have the luxury of deliberation. He could not workshop options or wait for consensus. His authority came from immediacy. Leadership in crisis compresses time until reflection becomes impossible. Decisions must be made while consequences are still forming. That pressure breaks many people, not because they lack intelligence, but because they seek certainty where none exists. Baker accepted uncertainty as permanent. He acted without knowing if his actions would succeed, not because he believed failure was unlikely, but because inaction guaranteed failure. This mindset is critical. Many leaders freeze not because they lack solutions, but because they demand assurance before acting. Baker understood that assurance is a luxury unavailable in real crises. Also a deeper lesson about initiative. Baker did not wait for permission. He did not escalate problems upward in hopes someone else would solve them. He recognized that responsibility cannot be delegated upward when time runs out. Leadership means owning the problem even when authority is ambiguous. Especially then, modern systems often punish initiative when it disrupts hierarchy. Baker's story shows why that instinct is dangerous. If leaders are trained to wait for approval during emergencies, systems collapse when approval cannot arrive. Baker's effectiveness came from acting within intent, not instruction. He understood the purpose of his mission and adapted behavior accordingly. Distinction matters. Obedience follows rules. Leadership follows intent. Baker followed intent. A critical element of his leadership was emotional containment. He experienced loss repeatedly throughout the day. Men were killed within yards of him. Others screamed as mortars landed. Yet he did not allow grief to overwhelm function. He processed emotion later, in private, when action no longer depended on clarity. During combat, emotion was deferred, not denied. This ability separates functioning leaders from those who become emotionally paralyzed under pressure. The war, Baker never framed his actions as destiny or inevitability. He did not believe he was meant to survive. He understood how close the margin had been. This awareness prevented arrogance. Leaders who mistake survival for destiny often repeat risk unnecessarily. Baker did not. He treated survival as fragile, not deserved. Humility shaped how he lived afterward. He did not chase attention. He did not center his identity around his actions. He lived quietly, understanding that meaning does not require an audience. This is an uncomfortable lesson for modern leadership culture, which often equates visibility with value. Baker's life contradicts that equation entirely. Delayed recognition of his actions exposes another systemic truth. Institutions resist narratives that challenge their self-image. Baker's competence conflicted with entrenched beliefs. Acknowledging his leadership meant acknowledging institutional failure. Systems rarely do this willingly. They correct history slowly, reluctantly, and often too late to matter personally. Leaders must understand this reality. Acting correctly does not guarantee institutional support. In fact, it may provoke resistance. Baker did not allow this to alter his behavior. He did not adjust his ethics to match recognition. He acted based on responsibility, not reward. The lesson extends far beyond military contexts. Whistleblowers, crisis managers, reformers, and emergency responders often face similar dynamics. Systems prefer stability over truth. Leaders must choose whether they serve systems or outcomes. Baker chose outcomes. Another overlooked aspect of his story is how he balanced decisiveness with adaptability. He did not cling to initial plans. He revised continuously based on conditions. When advance became impossible, he withdrew. When withdrawal became dangerous, he attacked. When attacking no longer served survival, he disengaged. This fluidity is essential. Rigid leaders break when reality shifts. Adaptive leaders survive. Leadership failures occur not from bad decisions, but from refusal to revise decisions. Baker revised constantly. He treated decisions as provisional, not sacred. This allowed him to respond to evolving threats without ego. Deepest level, Baker's story forces an uncomfortable question. What is leadership for? Is it to achieve objectives or to protect people? Baker's answer was clear. Objectives matter only insofar as people survive to pursue them. When those priorities conflict, people come first. The principle challenges cultures that glorify sacrifice without discrimination. Baker understood that sacrifice must have purpose. Death without outcome is not noble, it is waste. Leaders who fail to recognize this confuse martyrdom with responsibility. The reason Baker's story endures is not because of a clever tactic or dramatic moment. It endures because it demonstrates leadership stripped to its core. No speeches, no symbolism, no guarantee of reward. Just decisions made under pressure with incomplete information and irreversible consequences. Leadership, in its truest form, is not inspiring. It is exhausting. It isolates. It demands acceptance of blame without assurance of credit. Baker carried that weight without complaint. The lesson remains relevant because human systems have not changed. Crises still emerge without warning. Information remains incomplete. Institutions remain slow. People still depend on individuals to act when systems hesitate. When that moment arrives, leadership will not look like confidence. It will look like clarity under uncertainty. It will look like action without applause. It will look like someone choosing loss wisely so others can live with the outcome.